January 16th, 2019, and I have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to get right into it. I want to begin today with a tweet that came out from Mike Pompeo. That's something we've been seeing brew for a very long time. There were recent reports that leaks apparently saying that Trump's administration was going to outright claim that Maduro's illegitimate and claim the other person the president. I didn't report on it because they were leaks, and I don't feel like we can trust mainstream media leaks today. However, we've now seen a tweet from Bolton that I recently covered, and now this tweet coming out from Mike Pompeo that makes this all become much more clear. And I'm going to dissect this for people that may think this says something other than what I'm getting to here. It says, Mike Pompeo's tweet says, "We congratulate, recognize, and support the courage of Venezuela's National Assembly to formally declare Maduro a usurper of democracy and to transfer executive responsibilities to the National Assembly per Articles 233, 333, and 350 of the Venezuelan Constitution." Now, to those that may be just reading this without the understanding what this means, which is why they put stuff like this out, they may go, wow, that sounds like Venezuela is now standing against Maduro. Their own government is standing up and saying that they don't recognize him. Well, that's actually not the truth. And there's much to understand within this. As Wikipedia would put it, to understand what the National Assembly, Venezuela's National Assembly actually is, as Wikipedia puts it, it's the National Assembly de jure legislation, meaning like of the day for Venezuela, and it was first elected in 2000. However, the Constituent Assembly was elected in 2017. So from that point forward, the two legislatures have operated in parallel, with the National Assembly forming the primary opposition to President Nicolas Maduro, you don't say, and with the Constituent Assembly being his primary supporters. The legitimate government that was elected in Venezuela. Now, in January 2019, the National Assembly reasserted its authority, declaring Maduro's May 2018 re-election void and declaring Juan Guaido, or it's a Guaido, I believe, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, acting president. Of course. This is the illegitimate legislature that's basically standing up and saying this now. Now, as it gets even more interesting, on March 29th, 2017, the Supreme Court stripped the Assembly, the National Assembly that Pompeo was backing, of its powers, ruling that all powers would be transferred to the Supreme Court. The previous year, the court has found the Assembly in contempt for swearing in legislators whose elections had been deemed invalid by the courts themselves. See, now it's interesting how you don't get all that from Mike Pompeo standing up and saying, look, the government doesn't support Maduro, even though the government, the legitimate government of Venezuela, does. Now, you may want to tell yourself, or you may, think based on your own research, which is okay, that Venezuela and their government is illegitimate because it was an illegitimate election. It was all illegal, except for the fact that I continue to reiterate. And I was actually corrected recently that apparently hundreds of international observers watched this election and deemed it absolutely legitimate. One of the most legitimate they've ever seen, from the words of Jimmy Carter himself. So think of that when you consider what's happening here, as they continue to try to demonize and literally take a side with the puppet that they're backing over what everyone in Venezuela, or at least the majority, supports, which is Maduro, which is the Constituent Assembly, which was elected in 2017, which supports Maduro. And the National Assembly, which Pompeo is currently standing behind, the Supreme Court itself stripped them of their powers and has actually held them in contempt for trying to create some kind of side legislature that has been deemed invalid by the court itself. Sounds very similar to what we just talked about Saudi Arabia doing in Yemen. This is what they do. They're trying to establish a side government and claim that that's the real government and justify their actions. And ultimately, it has nothing to do with anything with people or democracy or governments. It has to do with, their massive gold supply, their massive oil reserves, and many other things, such as them dropping the US dollar. As any country in South America that actually tries to veer away from US interests historically has seen regime change efforts. They're aggressively, and they have been aggressively trying to manipulate Venezuela for decades. And as we just recently talked about Honduras and so many other places, the U.S. government manipulates it, sticks its nose in these places, and always, without fail, unseats the actual democratically elected government when it goes against U.S. interests. So yet again, we have an example of the United States government standing with the side of a dictator over what the people actually want while telling you the exact opposite. It's very alarming to see. You can't misunderstand the information, but see, the point is they hope that you don't look further. They hope that you're not smart enough to do the smallest amount of research to see that the government he's pretending is backing, the other person is actually illegitimate and has been voted down by the Supreme Court. Go figure. But, in the meantime, as Global Research puts it, hey, good news, kids are dying in Venezuela, sanctions are working. Because this is what sanctions are meant to do, as the U.S. government's own documentation has roundly pointed out. The starvation tactics. This is what they're meant to do. And then they turn around and point to Venezuela and say, look at how terrible it is in Venezuela. We need to help these people, ignoring the fact that their very actions, their very foreign policy is at least in large part responsible for what's happening there. I really hope people can think about this stuff for themselves and not just blindly take what the government's telling you, the very government that's been lying to you about just about everything for a very long time. Moving on to a related story in regard to the southern border, as it were, and this coming from Zero Hedge, entitled U.S. Extends Troop Deployment, at Mexican Border as Migrant Caravan Leaves Honduras. Now, for those that were tuning in for Syria, stay tuned. We're going to get to the big stories of the day, but I wanted to start with these important, all this is laying the groundwork for the larger show of today. Now, this story is important to me because it extends the troop deployment. Who didn't see that coming? All of us that warned, these temporary things they put out, like using military to enforce things within this country, just kind of tends to drag on, like the Patriot Act. Not like this is the exact same thing of that or even reasonably close, but the reality is we're talking about something that is many would argue is a violation of the Constitution that was meant to be, it was actually set to expire on the 31st of this month. And it looks like another caravan popped up. We need to extend this until a much, much longer. And I'd be willing to bet, I'll call it now, that it will be extended yet again when it comes to pass. Showing us that this is much larger than just the politics of the day, much larger than the caravans. There's something bigger going on here. Now, as this new migrant caravan leaves Honduras, which we just talked about, the U.S. government has put boots on the ground, military, Marines in Honduras 7 times in the 20th century, of course, to support corporations. Your tax dollars going to support foreign corporations, but, they don't tell you that stuff. Easily verifiable for yourself. I believe in 2009, they unseated the democratically elected leader and put someone else in place. This is what they do. They create destabilized efforts in South America and the countries they try to overthrow. Now we have a new caravan coming from Honduras with the goal of crossing into the U.S., according to these reports, over the southern border. The Pentagon announced on Tuesday that it would extend the military's mission on the southern border, according to Reuters. The mission will be extended through at least September 30th, according to the Pentagon. At least September 30th. So it went from a couple of months to deal with this one thing to now all the way until September, we're going to have military enforcing the border. Now, for some, they're going to say, hooray, because they're invading our country, because they're simply taking what the government's telling them. Now, clearly, there's a problem here. But if you ignore the fact that the U.S. is what's created this problem to begin with their foreign policy in South America, you're being willfully ignorant of the larger situation here. This situation needs dealing with to some degree, but not with the military, not with a wall. That's my opinion. Please come to your own. I hope people can think for themselves. But the reality here is this is extending a military presence within the United States, and that's dangerous. Now, there are currently about 2,350 troops assigned to the border mission right now. More troops than they claim are in Syria are currently positioned within the United States on the border. Now, the deployment was expected to end on January 31st, like I said. Now, a temporary act is being extended. Like I said, sort of the way the Patriot Act continues to be extended, that temporary Patriot Act. Or, the authorization for use of military force, which gives them the right in their mind to invade countries if they point to terrorism. All these things were supposed to be temporary, and, they just keep getting extended. Trump extended them too, despite his rhetoric on the campaign trail. So we have to see it in the same light. Wonder how long this will continue to be extended. And as I always point out, if this happened under Obama, all the same people cheering for it would be screaming about martial law. Now, it's also important to recognize, as I continue to point out, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, following the Civil War, forbade the U.S. military from performing law enforcement functions on American soil. Now, you may argue that's not what they're doing, and that's a fair argument. But this is a very, very shaky ground that we're on here. I'll point out that the troops who are actually restricted, as they're reporting, by U.S. law from engaging in law enforcement activities doesn't mean they're not doing so. They claim they have mostly performed supporting services like building reinforcements at the border bases and assisting Border Patrol agents. But if you really think that they would put military there to stand by and say, yeah, get them, border agents, we'll support you from the sidelines, and if you really think that's what they're there for, you're being blinded yet again. If something happens, you know that they're going to be, which is whether there will be enforcing immigration law on U.S. soil. That's what will be happening. It's all semantics when you want to say, oh, it's from the other side, it's foreign policy. This is what they're doing, is they're using semantics to manipulate what's really happening, which is U.S. military on the ground enforcing U.S. law. Bottom line. Now, I know people get very emotionally attached to these things, so please don't just take my word for it. Do your research. Don't just take Trump's word for it. Don't just take any government official's word for it. This is something that I think will continue to be extended, so hopefully you can keep paying attention and see as this plays out.